To them, she was an angel, all warm smiles and gentle hands, serving tea with the kind of sweetness that makes people believe they've found a treasure. But the moment the door closed and their footsteps faded away, her eyes turned sharp and cold, her grip no longer soft but cruel. She yanked my hair when I moved too slow, slid my pills into her pocket while telling me they were for my own good, and leaned in close just to whisper names she thought would break me. I never gave her the satisfaction of seeing me cry. I just watched, remembered, and kept it all where she couldn't touch it. One morning, I decided this story would not end in silence. Before I go any further, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to me. It means more than I can say, and I'd like you to tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because I want to know how far my words travel. Have you ever had a moment where you told the truth, but the people you cared about looked at you like you were making it up, like you were confused or exaggerating? It's a lonely feeling, being right and yet being dismissed. And sometimes that kind of loneliness weighs heavier than the betrayal itself. If you've been through that, you understand how it settles in your chest and makes you second-guess everything you've seen and heard. But I want you to know that your story matters just as much as mine. And sometimes speaking it out loud is the first step toward taking back your strength. I have lived in the same little house for more than 40 years. A place that holds every memory I have built since the day my husband and I first turned the key in the door. We raised our family here, celebrated birthdays around the same worn dining table, watched the seasons change through the same front windows. After he passed, the house felt too big some days. But it was mine, and it was home, and I told myself I could manage on my own. For a long time, I did, but over the years my health began to slow me down. Tasks that once felt simple now took more energy, and though I hated to admit it, I started to feel the strain. My family saw it too, and their concern came from a place of love. Or at least that's what I believed then. They began to bring up the idea of hiring someone to help, not full-time, just enough to make sure I was eating well, keeping up with my medications, and not straining myself with the chores I stubbornly refused to let go of. I remember sitting in my kitchen as they explained it, their voices soft, reassuring, telling me it would be just for peace of mind. I didn't like the idea of a stranger in my home, of losing even a little of the independence I had fought so hard to keep. But I also didn't want them to worry, so I agreed. I told myself it might even be nice to have a bit of company during the day, someone to share a cup of tea with, someone who could help me with the heavier tasks without making me feel like a burden. Looking back now, I realize how naive that was. I thought they were giving me safety, but they gave me something else entirely. When she first arrived, everything seemed harmless enough, even pleasant. She had a warm smile that could melt any doubt you might be holding on to, and a voice so gentle it could almost convince you she cared before you even knew her. On those first days, she moved through my home as if she had been part of it for years, brewing tea just the way I liked it, folding the laundry with neat precision, plumping the pillows on my couch so they looked like they belonged in a magazine. She made a habit of straightening the flowers in the vase on the dining table, fussing over the curtains to let the sunlight in, and humming softly to herself in a way that made the house feel almost alive again. When my family came by to check on me, she was all sweetness and attentiveness, bustling into the kitchen to pour tea for everyone, serving it with a plate of cookies she claimed she had baked that morning, though I never saw her turn the oven on. She joined in on conversations, laughed at their jokes, and complimented them in a way that made them glow with appreciation. I could see the relief in their faces, that subtle loosening of worry when they looked at me and thought, "She's in good hands." I even remember my eldest leaning over to me one afternoon, smiling as they whispered, "See? She's wonderful. We were right to bring her in." I wanted to believe it, for their sake, for mine. It was easier to nod along and let them think they had done the right thing. But even in those early moments, something about her didn't sit right with me. It was in the way her eyes would shift just slightly when no one was looking, or how her laughter sometimes seemed a little too quick, a little too perfectly timed, as if she had rehearsed it. I told myself I was imagining it, that maybe I was being unfair because I missed doing things on my own. And so, I kept quiet. But the truth of it was clearer than I wanted to admit. The moment the car doors closed and my family's voices faded down the driveway, I watched her smile melt away, like a mask slipping off at the end of a long performance. Her eyes hardened, her posture straightened, and she no longer moved with that exaggerated gentleness. She didn't ask if I wanted more tea or if I needed anything. Instead, she walked past me without a word, as if my presence no longer mattered, now that the audience had gone. It was such a stark change that I almost doubted I had seen it, but deep down I knew I wasn't wrong. That was the moment I realized the person they saw and the person I was left with when they left were not the same at all. It began so quietly that at first I thought I was imagining it. Little things that might have seemed harmless to anyone else but felt strange to me. The tea she used to serve piping hot came to me lukewarm. The meals that were once set neatly in front of me now arrived cold, with vegetables that were limp and unseasoned, bread that had gone slightly stale. When I asked about it, she would smile without warmth and say she must have been distracted, that she would do better next time. But somehow, the next time was always the same. There was a tone in her voice too, not loud or openly cruel, but a subtle edge that lingered in the space between her words. She would repeat things I had said back to me with a hint of mockery, as though my requests or stories were amusing, something to be laughed at when I wasn't looking. It wasn't just her words, it was her presence. There were moments when she would stand in the doorway, her body filling the space so I couldn't pass, looking down at me with that flat expression that made my skin prickle. Other times, she would step in too close while handing me something, her shoulder brushing mine in a way that felt less like an accident and more like a reminder that she was the one moving around me, not the other way around. She seemed to take up more space than necessary, to move with an air of quiet control that left me feeling smaller in my own home. I tried to tell myself she might be having a bad day, that perhaps she was stressed or distracted, that I was being too sensitive. After all, she was still doing her job on the surface, cleaning, organizing, tending to tasks. But there was a coldness underneath it all, a kind of indifference that pressed in on me like a shadow. I began to notice how she would forget small things I had asked for, like fetching the book I had left in the other room, or helping me reach a box from the top shelf. She would nod when I made the request, and then later look surprised when I asked about it again, insisting I must not have told her at all. It was a subtle thing, but repeated enough times that it chipped away at my confidence. Sometimes I would sit in my chair and watch her move around the room, trying to figure out if I was overreacting, if my mind was simply inventing patterns that weren't there. But then there would be another moment, her eyes meeting mine for a fraction too long, her lips curling ever so slightly in a way that wasn't quite a smile, and the feeling of unease would grow heavier. I wanted to believe the good face she showed to my family was real, but the truth was starting to whisper in my ear, telling me that what I saw when we were alone was the truth of who she really was, and that whisper was getting harder to ignore. It did not take long for those quiet cracks to turn into something sharper, something I could no longer brush aside as harmless. One afternoon, I was walking slowly from the living room toward the kitchen, my hand trailing along the wall for balance, when she came up behind me and, without warning, yanked at my hair. Not hard enough to knock me down, but just enough to jolt me forward and send a sharp pain across my scalp. I froze, shocked, and before I could say anything, she muttered that I was moving too slowly and she had things to do. It was said with such casual cruelty, as though my pace was not a part of who I was now, but some personal inconvenience to her. From then on, I began to notice other things she did when no one was around. Some nights, I would wake to find my bedroom door locked from the outside. In the morning, she would claim she had done it for my safety, to make sure no one could get in. But the key was always with her, and I could not ignore how trapped it made me feel. I began to realize she was rearranging or even hiding my personal belongings. Letters I had kept from my husband, a brooch I had worn for years, even my favorite reading glasses. When I asked, she would tilt her head and say she had no idea what I was talking about. Then later, I would find the missing item tucked away somewhere I would never have put it. The worst of it came with my medication. At first, I thought I was forgetting to take it. But then I saw her slip half the pills into her pocket while telling me the dosage was too high, and she was adjusting it for my own good. Her tone was smooth, practiced, the kind that could convince anyone else she was being careful and attentive. But I could feel the difference in my body. The way my energy dropped, my mind dulled just enough to make me doubt myself. And in those quiet, empty hours of the afternoon, she would lean down close to me and whisper words meant to carve away at my spirit. "Confused old woman," she would say, her lips so close to my ear that I could feel the heat of her breath. "Nobody believes you. They all think you need me." Those words stayed with me long after she left the room, echoing in the silence, pressing on my chest. But it wasn't confusion that I was feeling. It was clarity, cold and undeniable. I knew then that if I wanted to survive whatever game she was playing, I needed more than just the truth in my heart. I needed proof, something she could not twist, something that would speak louder than her lies. One evening, after she had gone home and the house had settled into that heavy stillness that comes after a long day, I sat in my chair and thought about everything she had done. Every word she had said, every cold, calculated gesture she had made when no one else was around. I knew then that telling my family without anything to show them would be useless. They had already made up their minds about her. And to them, she was still that smiling angel who brewed tea and kept my home spotless. But I could not just sit there and let her win. I needed something solid, something they could not dismiss with a smile and a shake of the head. I went to the spare room, a place I rarely visited anymore, and opened the old cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Inside were pieces of my life stacked in layers, photographs, letters, little keepsakes from trips we took long ago. Beneath them all, wrapped in a faded scarf, I found an old notebook. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed at the edges, but the binding was still firm. I ran my fingers over it and felt a strange sense of resolve settle over me. This would be my weapon, quiet but sharp. That night, I began writing. I noted the date, the time, and exactly what had happened. Right down to the way her voice sounded when she said it, the way her eyes narrowed, the way her hand gripped my arm, or how she leaned in to block my path. I wrote about the missing pills, about finding my brooch in the bottom of a kitchen drawer, about the way she locked my bedroom door. Every word was deliberate, every sentence a piece of a larger picture I was building. I even recorded the insults, word for word, so there could be no mistake about what had been said. I wrote late into the night, the only sound in the room the faint scratch of my pen on the paper. My hands trembled at times, partly from the chill, partly from the weight of what I was putting down. But I did not stop. When I finished, I closed the notebook and slid it under my bed, hidden from view but close enough that I could reach for it whenever I needed to add more. The next day, and every day after, I kept at it. Whenever something happened, I waited until she was gone, then pulled out the notebook and wrote it down in detail, making sure to capture every moment exactly as it had been. I guarded that notebook as if it were a lifeline, because in a way, it was. She could take my belongings, she could tamper with my medicine, she could even try to wear me down with her words, but she could not erase the truth once it was written in ink. When you can't shout, you let the ink speak for you. And I intended for mine to be heard loud and clear. It was a bright morning, the kind that usually made me feel a little lighter, a little more hopeful. I had just settled myself in the armchair by the front window when I saw my neighbor, Mrs. Whitaker, walking her dog past my house. We had known each other for years, and though we didn't talk as often as we used to, there was always a warm wave or a quick chat whenever our paths crossed. That day, she stopped at the gate and called out a cheerful hello, and I smiled, glad for the small break in my routine. I stood up slowly, careful with my balance, and opened the door to greet her properly. Before I could take a step outside, the caregiver appeared at my side. At first, I thought she was coming to help me to the porch, but instead, she placed her hand firmly on my shoulder, almost pushing me back into the doorway. "You don't want to be out here too long," she said loudly, her voice carrying down the walk. "You'll get confused and wander off again." Her words struck me like a slap. I had never wandered anywhere in my life, and she knew it. The way she said it, so casual, so certain, was meant for Mrs. Whitaker's ears as much as mine. I felt my face flush hot, the humiliation rising in me like a wave I could not stop. Mrs. Whitaker's smile faltered, her eyes darting between us. I opened my mouth to correct her, to say something, anything, but the caregiver gave a little laugh, that fake, tinkling sound she used when she wanted to smooth over her cruelty, as if it were just a harmless joke. She even patted my arm, a condescending gesture that made my stomach turn, and then stepped outside to chat with Mrs. Whitaker herself, blocking me from joining them. I stood there in the shadow of my own doorway, hearing their muffled voices, feeling the sting of being treated like a spectacle in front of someone who had always known me as strong, capable, and clear-minded. When she finally came back inside, still wearing that pleasant mask, she acted as though nothing had happened. She asked if I wanted tea, her tone light and sweet, but I saw the glint in her eyes. She enjoyed it. She wanted to see me diminished, to plant seeds of doubt in others, so that if I ever spoke against her, they would already be inclined to believe her version of things. That was the moment something in me shifted. All the small humiliations, the cold meals, the stolen pills, the whispered insults, they had been building to this, and now the weight of them settled into a hard, steady resolve inside me. She thought she owned my silence, that I would keep enduring whatever she chose to do behind closed doors. She thought I was too old, too worn down to push back. She was wrong. I knew then that the pages in my notebook were not enough to stay hidden forever. They were meant to be seen, meant to shine a light on the darkness she had been weaving around me. That morning, standing in the quiet after her performance for my neighbor, I decided that I would be the one to decide how this story ended, and it would not end with me cowering in my own home. The day I chose to act was not dramatic or loud, it was quiet. The kind of day where even the air feels heavy with its own stillness. She had gone to the kitchen to gather her things, telling me she needed to make a quick trip to the store. I sat in my chair, my heart steady, but my mind racing. I had been waiting for an opportunity like this, one where I could move without her shadow following me from room to room. The moment I heard the front door close and the sound of her car pulling away, I knew my time had come. I went to my bedroom and reached under the bed, my fingers finding the worn cover of the notebook I had been guarding for weeks. Lifting it into my hands felt heavier than it should have. Not because of its weight, but because of what it held. Every insult, every bruise, every theft of my dignity written down in careful, deliberate strokes. I had already prepared an envelope days before, one large enough to hold the notebook without bending it. The address was written clearly on the front, my grandson's name in firm letters. I knew what I was doing might change the way he looked at me, but I also knew he was the only one who could take what I had gathered and make sure it could not be ignored. He worked at the local news station, a place where stories didn't just get heard, they got seen. And I needed this to be seen. I slipped the notebook into the envelope, sealed it, and held it against my chest for a moment, almost like saying goodbye to a piece of myself. Then I straightened my shoulders and began the slow, deliberate walk to the front door. My steps were steady, though my legs felt heavier with each one. And when I stepped outside, the sunlight seemed sharper than usual, as if the world itself was watching. The street was quiet, only the sound of a bird somewhere in the distance, and the stillness gave me the courage to keep moving. I walked down the path to the gate, my hand brushing against the cool metal as I opened it. The mailbox stood just a few steps beyond, plain and unassuming, but to me it was a doorway to something bigger. I slid the envelope inside, the soft scrape of paper against metal sounding louder than I expected, and when it was gone from my hands, I felt something loosen inside me. I closed the mailbox and stood there for a moment, looking down the empty street, knowing that my words were now on their way to someone who would not brush them aside or call them exaggerations. If my family wouldn't believe me, then the truth would find its own stage, and this time it would not be hidden behind closed doors or buried under polite smiles. I turned and walked back toward the house, slower this time, not because I was afraid, but because I knew that with every step I was moving closer to the end of her control and the beginning of something she never saw coming. When she came back from the store that afternoon, her arms full of bags, and her voice carrying that false cheer she always put on when announcing herself, I watched her move around the kitchen as if nothing had changed. She had no idea that the notebook, the one thing she could never twist to her advantage, was already out of my hands and making its way to someone who would not be fooled by her sweet performance. She went about her tasks, putting away groceries with sharp, efficient movements, occasionally glancing at me with that faint curl of her lip, the one that told me she was just looking for an excuse to cut me down again. I kept my face still, gave her nothing to react to, but inside I could feel the slow, steady beat of my resolve. She was living in borrowed time now, and though she didn't know it, every word she spoke, every cold look she gave me, was just another line in the story I had already sent out into the world. The days that followed were a strange kind of torture. Not because she did anything worse than usual, but because I had to live with the knowledge of what was coming while pretending I didn't. She still served my meals cold, still hid small things so I would have to ask for them, still locked my bedroom door at night under the excuse of keeping me safe. And every time she whispered one of her cruel little names, every time she told me no one would believe me, I would silently remind myself that the proof was already far beyond her reach. But even with that comfort, the waiting was not easy. At night, I would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind caught between two worlds. Part of me still felt the familiar fear that she might find out what I had done before it could reach the right hands, that she might tighten her control before I could be free of her. But another part of me, quieter yet stronger, clung to the anticipation of what would happen when the truth finally landed in front of the person who could make it matter. The thought of it kept me awake, but it also kept me going. When my family visited during that time, they still spoke of her with such relief, as though she had been some kind of blessing sent to make my life easier. They smiled at her, thanked her for taking such good care of me, told her she was an angel, and I would sit there, nodding along, my hands folded in my lap. I didn't correct them. Not yet. There was no point in speaking when the words alone would do nothing to change their minds. Let them believe it for now, I thought. The truth would speak for itself soon enough, and when it did, they would remember every time they ignored my unease, every time they dismissed my hesitation, and they would have to see her for who she truly was. And so, I waited, calm on the surface, but with a quiet storm building inside me, knowing the clock was ticking down toward the moment she would no longer be able to hide. It was 3 days later when it happened, a morning that began like any other. The air outside was cool and the light streaming through the curtains was pale and steady. She was in the kitchen, clattering dishes just a little too loudly, as if she wanted me to hear how busy and useful she was. I was sitting in my chair, my hands folded in my lap when I heard it, a knock at the door. Not the kind that comes from a friendly neighbor or a delivery driver, but a loud, deliberate, unhurried knock. It was the kind of knock that carried authority, the kind that told you someone on the other side wasn't here for small talk. For a moment, the whole house seemed to pause. I stood slowly, my knees stiff, and made my way to the door. When I opened it, I saw a uniformed police officer standing there, his expression calm but serious. Beside him was my grandson, his face set in a way I had never seen before, his reporter's badge clipped neatly to his jacket, catching the morning light. My heart lifted in a quiet, steady way. I knew in that instant that the envelope had made it into the right hands. Behind me, I heard her footsteps coming down the hallway, that quick, purposeful stride she used whenever she wanted to make herself part of whatever was happening. She appeared at my side, her smile already in place. But the moment she saw who was at the door, I felt the air shift. Her smile held for a second too long, then wavered at the edges, as if she couldn't quite keep it steady. Her eyes flicked from my grandson to the officer, and though she tried to keep her voice light when she asked if something was wrong, there was a tightness underneath it that she couldn't hide. I looked at her then, not with fear or hesitation, but with a calm I had been carrying inside me since the day I slipped that envelope into the mailbox. My voice was steady, almost gentle, when I said, "I think you're here for her." The words hung in the air between us, soft but unshakable, and for the first time since she set foot in my home, she didn't have a response ready. She just stood there, her hands curling slightly at her sides, as the officer stepped forward, and my grandson met my eyes with a look that told me everything I needed to know. The waiting was over. The officer stepped into the house, his voice calm but firm as he explained they had some questions to ask. My grandson followed, holding that same serious expression, his presence alone enough to steady me. She tried to keep her posture relaxed, folding her arms loosely, tilting her head in that way she used when she wanted to appear harmless. But her eyes were restless, flicking between them, searching for an angle. The officer began by mentioning a report that had been brought forward, a detailed account of events that had allegedly taken place in this very home. He held up the notebook, my notebook, the pages marked with careful notes, each one dated, each one written in the same steady hand. He read aloud from it, my words echoing back to me. Descriptions of cold meals, missing medication, the insults whispered when no one else could hear, the nights locked behind my own door. I could see the color drain from her face as the officer went on, each example matching something she thought had been forgotten. She interrupted, of course, her voice sharper now, insisting it was all lies, that I was confused, that I had imagined or misremembered things. She laughed in short bursts, a poor imitation of disbelief, but there was no warmth in it anymore. My grandson didn't flinch. He stepped forward and calmly explained that the details in my journal matched complaints from 2 other households she had worked in before. Cases that had never been fully pursued because no one had evidence like this. Her hands twitched at her sides, the mask slipping further with every word. The front door opened again, and my family stepped in, having been called by my grandson earlier that morning. They looked from me to her, confusion etched on their faces as they tried to understand what was unfolding. When the officer laid out the facts, reading from my own careful records, I watched their confusion shift to disbelief, then to something heavier, shame. They glanced at me, their eyes filled with regret, the weight of all the times they had dismissed my unease now pressing down on them. One of them stepped closer, their voice quiet when they said, "I'm so sorry, we didn't know." I didn't need their tears or long apologies. The truth was finally standing in the open where no smile of hers could hide it. The officer informed her that she would need to come with them for further questioning, and for the first time since she walked into my home, she had nothing left to say. As they led her out, she glanced back at me, but I met her look without blinking. It turns out, I wasn't her first. But I was her last. With her gone, the house felt different, lighter, as though the walls themselves could breathe again. I moved through my rooms without that shadow trailing behind me, without the constant weight of waiting for the next small cruelty. My independence was mine once more, and though my days were still quiet, they were my own. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's hidden in ink, written with a steady hand, and mailed with quiet courage. If you've ever had to fight to be believed, tell me below, or just write, "I stood my ground." And please do subscribe for more stories.